Welcome to this week's edition of Insights. And today we're focusing on not only being declared righteous before God, which happens when we come to faith, but we're also talking about becoming a friend of God. Recently, I was in Florida ministering with my good friend Stephen Burke. He founded a ministry called The Lord Will Provide, and something that Stephen likes to focus on, because it's so important in light of the day and hour we're living in, is to be a friend of God like Abraham versus being like Lot. Now, Lot was declared righteous. We know that from the scriptures as we read through Genesis, but specifically in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 7 and 8, Lot is called righteous. And yet, when we go back to the Genesis account and what happened leading up to Sodom and Gomorrah, the devastation, the judgment of those cities, is that while Lot was declared righteous, God shared with Abraham what was on his heart because Abraham was his friend. Abraham had God's inside track, so to speak. In other passages, even related to Genesis 18, we might say that Abraham had God's ear. A couple years ago, I was actually focusing on some of these concepts similar but a bit different, because where I was gleaning from was not only from Abraham's life, but also from the Upper Room Discourse when Jesus is teaching in John chapters 14 through 17. And of course, John 17 is that prayer. But in these chapters, there's these teachings by Jesus that point us to oneness with our Heavenly Father and walking with Him like Jesus did. And again, this idea, it's not just important as a timeless truth, it is that, but it's also crucial in light of the days in which we're living. In John 14, verses 20 and 21, it talks about Him being in us and us in Him, and we're in the Father, and we're one with Him. That's what God is calling us into, in essence, being a friend of God like Abraham was. In John 15, verse 15, Jesus looks at His disciples, and He calls them friends. You're no longer slaves. I call you friends because you know everything I've told you. And then in John 17, Jesus is praying not only for the disciples and believers back then, but also for those who would believe, meaning us. And it says in John 17 that God, again, is calling us to be unified as believers and, of course, unified with Him in this idea of oneness. And so this is a tremendously important concept, not only from Abraham's life in contrast to Lot, but also in light of the days in which we're living. It says again about Lot in 2 Peter chapter 2, verses 7 and 8. It says that Lot's soul was tormented. He was righteous. His soul was tormented at what was going on in the culture around him. Have you ever felt that? Like when you look at this culture, I'm imagining that we all have felt disturbed in our spirit and so forth in light of what takes place in the culture. Well, that's how Lot felt. But to move past that, and again, as my friend Stephen Burke likes to emphasize, not only for now, although it is for now, but in light of what's coming to our nation. So I look forward to being with you again next week on Insights.